So let's check in. We're in the middle of a sermon series now on purpose, and it's to get at the question that many of us have held, and we probably ask continually, that is, God, what is your purpose for my life? What on earth am I here for? We've learned over the last few weeks that the purpose that God gives us is grounded in God's mission to the world, what God is already up to bring salvation to the ends of the earth. We learned a couple of weeks ago that vocation is bigger than just our job, what we do every day. It's our calling to be disciples. It's our calling to follow Christ and our call to invite others to follow Christ. So that's our vocation. No matter what we do with our days, that undergirds everything. Last week we learned about specifically discovering our calling. How does God call? How do we know that it's God and not the burrito that we had last night talking? So we began looking at Moses' call story, how Moses was in the desert shepherding sheep, and he encounters a burning bush, and God speaks to him through this bush. He uses this opportunity to get Moses' attention, and he says, Moses, I want you to go and confront Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go, free them from slavery. And so we ask the question, where are the burning bushes in your life? Where is God speaking to you? Who are the people? What are the circumstances, the brokenness from your past, or the burdens and the deep hurts that you feel for the world? Where are all of those things combining where you hear God's voice in them? And so today we're going to talk about how you actually live your call, so going from hearing to living. And what are some of the hindrances that keep us from being obedient when God calls us? We're going to go there today. First, let me ask you a question. How many of you love to be evaluated? Anybody want to jump up and down, wave your hands? The truth is nobody loves to be evaluated at work. This starts when we're very young. I can remember waiting to get tests back in school and being nervous, even if I felt I did well, about the grade that would be on top. It's nerve-wracking to be evaluated. And what student honestly loves taking the STAR test? I mean, other than the fact that you get to sit there for long periods of time without instruction, right? But other than that, really, how many of you love, if you're in school, love to take the STAR test? Really? I didn't think so, right? 4 days of just administrating a test. So when you get to be an adult, and if you're a child with us today, I hate to burst your bubble, but your moms and dads and grandparents and everybody continue to be evaluated. How many of you love performance evaluation day at work? Anybody? In case you don't have to go through this exhilarating process, let me tell you how it works. So generally, you're given a self-evaluation where you get to sit and contemplate how you're performing in various areas. And then your supervisor gets to fill out the same form from their perspective of how you're doing. And then you come together and you have a wonderful conversation, and you get to see how you think you're doing matches up with how your supervisor perceives that you are doing. Now, here's how these things normally go. You'll have a bajillion categories probably. Hopefully you have 10, but manageable. But a lot of times you have a bajillion that you're evaluated on, and you're going to get exceeds expectations on all but maybe 2. And then you're going to get, just average or needs improvement on a couple, perhaps. And then if you're like me, instead of focusing on the bajillion minus 2 that you were excellent in, what are you going to focus on? The areas that you need improvement. And excuses abound, and I've heard these over and over again. You may have made some, I have too. Confession time, right? Well, if I had the form earlier and I knew what they were going to be evaluating me on, I would have risen to the occasion and not needed improvement. Let's face it, it's the same form they used last year. You knew what was going to be on it. Okay, so we've got that. The second is, if my supervisor had just told me that I was deficient in a particular area, I would have risen to the occasion, right? So this is the form versus the telling. But we all lapse back into familiar patterns between evaluations. That's why companies do these evaluations every year. It's to revisit the conversation. It's uncomfortable. Whenever we're talking about deficiencies or areas of growth, it does become uncomfortable, but these can also be productive conversations. The whole educational system in our country is founded on this idea that we can only hold as much knowledge as our weakest subject area. Think of a barrel for a minute. A barrel is a bunch of wood staves or slats held together with brackets on the top and the bottom. If you fill a barrel with water, that barrel is only going to be able to hold as much water as the shortest stave. You can have a bunch of high ones, but the lowest one is going to be where the water runs out if you try to fill it above that. So if you're in school, for example, and you excel in many subjects, you get an A in reading and writing and history and PE and art, but you get a C in math. The C is that shortest stave in your barrel. So what do your parents, if you're in the educational system or parents, what do you have your child focus on? You don't have them do more history because they have an A in history. What do you do? You have them focus on getting that grade up in math. And that's a great way to evaluate people in school, simply because we need a basic skill set to be highly contributing members of society. Those are good things. However, when we start looking at living out our calling, it doesn't quite work the way that we're evaluated throughout our school career. And I want to focus there today. Let's revisit Moses' story for just a moment. God calls Moses. Moses, I want you to go and confront Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go, to free them from slavery. And in Exodus 3, you begin to read that story and you see that Moses is nervous. First off, he says, God, why me? Who am I that you would call me to do something as grand and as big as that? And God says, I will be with you. Go, I'm sending you. So if you read on, you begin to see Moses' anxieties bubbling up. I mean, if you've been called by God to do something that seems so much bigger than what you're currently doing, it can be a scary, scary thing. And so first off, Moses was a little bit nervous about going and confronting the Pharaoh. We know Moses' story, right? He was put in a basket on the river. Pharaoh's daughter rescues him from death, basically, and raises him in her own household. He grew up at Pharaoh's feet. For all intents and purposes, Pharaoh's his granddad. But he's also the most powerful ruler in the known world at this time. I mean, this calling, go to your granddad and tell him to let these slaves go free. The Israelite people were making bricks. They were the engine that was fueling the Pharaoh's construction projects, the fortification of the city, the protection from military exploitation from other nations. If they were to be freed, it would stop everything. So there was a big risk. First off, Moses could have been put to death. I don't like what you're saying, and I don't want you spreading it around. Done, right? That had to have been on Moses' mind at least a little bit. And then there's the thing where he might say, yeah, right. God called you to do this? Shh, see ya, right? But then there's also the other daunting task. Go and tell Pharaoh and then lead my people out of Egypt under cover of darkness, right? So Moses begins to worry, well, even if Pharaoh consents, what is going to make all of these people follow me? And so God gave some pointers. So tell them I sent you. Tell them I'm the God of your ancestors and their ancestors, and that I have seen their misery, and I will lead them into a good and fertile and productive land, a better future. Tell them. And so in Exodus 4, Moses is freaking out. I mean, really, he's saying, God, what if Pharaoh doesn't do what I ask him to do? And God says he won't, but he'll do it because of my mighty hand and my outstretched arm. Not because of your strength, but because of my strength. He'll do it. What if the people don't listen to me? And God goes, I've got this too. I'm going to give you 3 signs. And if you're having trouble, I'm going to show my strength through your weakness. He says, the first sign is this. See that staff in your hand? Throw it down on the ground. Watch what happens. Boom. Ah, snake! Right? His staff becomes a snake. And he can pick it up, and it becomes a staff again. Pretty cool trick, right? But if that doesn't get their attention, God said, I'll give you another sign that it's me working through you. Put your hand in your cloak and pull it out. Ah, leprosy! And put it back in, it's healed, right? So if that doesn't get their attention, here's a third sign. Take some water out of the Nile. Drop it onto the dry ground, and it will turn to blood. I guarantee you they will listen and know that I am the one working through you if you perform those 3 signs. So God meets Moses' concerns every step of the way. You need a sign, you're fearful, here, I'll confirm it, step by step by step. Finally, we get to a place where Moses is stripped bare of everything except his weaknesses. And this is the time that he lays it all out before the Lord. I want to share this part of the story with you from Exodus 4, beginning in verse 10. I invite you to follow along as we read together. Moses said to the Lord, "O Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and of tongue." The Lord said to Moses, "Who gave man his mouth? Who makes him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." But Moses said, "O Lord, please send someone else." The Lord's anger burned against Moses, and God said, "What about your brother Aaron, the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and his heart will be glad when he sees you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and as if you were God to him. But take the staff in your hand so that you can perform miraculous signs with it." This is God's word for us today. Thanks be to God. So Moses keeps bringing these concerns before God, and God continues to meet them. And finally, Moses lays it all out. "God, I am not a gifted speaker. How in the world am I going to persuade anybody to do what you've asked me to do?" And God is patient. When we take our concerns to God, God meets us with patience to a point. I'm going to get there. But he says, "Who created human beings and who gave you your mouth? I will put my words into your mouth and teach you what to say." And then here's the shortest clause in the history of the Bible. "Now go." Now go. I've taken away all of your excuses. You have none. Now go. And how does Moses respond to God? You're just going to have to go ahead and send someone else. That's what it all boiled down to anyway, right? So here's a moment of confession. You ready? How many times have you told God, "But God, but God, but God"? How many times have you heard God speaking to you, calling you to do something, but you've said, "But God, this is not the right time. My children aren't old enough. It's not a good time to move. I'm almost ready to retire. Why don't you go ahead and send somebody else?" But God, but God, but God. I've heard excuses over the years. I've made plenty of them, which is where I've heard most of them come from, in all honesty. I'm too young. I can't do this. They'll never listen to me. Well, if that's been your excuse, look at Jeremiah. He was a young boy when God called him. And God's call was clear. He said, "Jeremiah, before you were even formed in your mother's womb, I knew you. And before you were even born, I set you apart to be a prophet to the nations." And Jeremiah says, "God, who am I to speak your words? I am too young." And God says, "Don't say that I am too young, because I will put my words in your mouth, and you will go and speak where I send you. You'll be a prophet to all of the people in power. You will tell them about my power to uproot and to plant the nations, to turn hearts and minds toward me again." God chose Jeremiah precisely because of his youth. Now, you may be saying, "Lance, that's fine and good, but I'm too old. I'm retired. I've been there, done that." Well, let me tell you something. Did you know Abram was 75 years old when God called him to leave his homeland, to take all of his property, his family, and travel across a desert land to a place he had never been before? And he promised him descendants. Now, you have to know this about Abram and Sarai, his wife. They had always wanted children, but were never able to have them. They, for all intents and purposes, considered themselves to be barren. And now they were well beyond childbearing years anyway. And so for God to call them, not only at 75 in retirement, to leave and to go, and then to say, "I'm going to give you kids as well," it made Sarai laugh. She's like, "No way. You kidding me?" And God did it. Dear friends, God doesn't make mistakes. God knows you. He knows your strengths. He knows your weaknesses. He knows when he calls you what your weaknesses are. You don't have to hide them from God. God knew that Moses was a stammerer. God knew that Moses wasn't eloquent and couldn't speak. But that's precisely one of the reasons God chose Moses. You see, Moses was focusing on his weaknesses, what he couldn't do. And it was hindering his vision and his sight to see all that God could do through him. Because you see, God had given Moses tremendous leadership gifts that could be used to galvanize the people and to take them where God wanted them to be. You know, the Apostle Paul, when you read about his story, it's nothing short of amazing. He talks about a thorn in his flesh. There was some weakness that he carried around throughout his whole ministry that hindered him from being as effective as he wanted to be. But he writes this. He says, God's grace is sufficient for me. God's strength is made perfect when I am weak. Of course, the Apostle Paul was responsible for the spread of the church throughout the known world during his lifetime. God used him, strengths and weaknesses alike. This same Paul, who had a thorn in his flesh, who said that God's strength is made perfect in his weakness, wrote in 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12 about gifts. Gifts that God has given every single one of us. And we all have them in combinations that are very unique to who we are. A gift is simply that. It's not something that you can coerce. It's not something that you buy for yourself. It's simply something that's given. Spiritual gifts are given to you by God. These are areas of strength and giftedness that God has knit you together to bear. And so when God calls you because precisely of your strengths. Now, Paul gives all kinds of examples of what these gifts are, what these strengths are. He says some will be gifted at encouraging, others will be gifted at serving, some at showing mercy, others leading, some preaching, some healing. There's all kinds of gifts, but it's the same Lord and the same Spirit who gives them all. What are your gifts? How has God knit you together to be just who you are, to offer the strengths that you offer the world? How are you letting your weaknesses get in the way of your strengths? Because you see, God wants to work through your weaknesses. That's precisely what God is going to use to show His power at work through you. But God's going to use your strengths to get the work done. There's an emerging field of research and organizational development about leading out of your strengths. You see, so much of our educational system is grounded in overcoming weaknesses that people get discouraged. When you continue to hammer at a weakness and it's not getting better, what happens? You get beat down. It leads to low self-esteem. Why do you think during performance evaluations we focus on the 2 areas that we need improvement rather than the bajillion -2 areas that we're doing things really well? It weakens our self-esteem. But when we focus on strengths, research is showing that people have higher self-confidence, and when you can get youth to focus on strengths, it leads to all kinds of career benefits. I'd love to share this study with you. Email me if you want to see it. But here, this is very compelling. The study says that 23% of Americans feel engaged in their workplaces. Isn't that sad? And organizations that don't allow employees to lead out of their strengths only show a 9% engagement from their employees in their work. Can you imagine the lack of productivity in most of these organizations? But get this. Organizations that focus on strengths and putting people in places where they can lead out of the way that God has knit them together, it shows a 73% engagement in their work. This is important stuff. We have to know how God has made us, and instead of just focusing on our deficiencies and bringing them up, which is important to an extent, we need to learn to capitalize on our strengths and to do what we do even better. Our calling comes out of that. And when we lead out of our strengths, we live the calling that God has given us. We have to leave our weaknesses to God and trust that God's going to show His strength in that. There's a mother of 4 who intended to be a stay-at-home mom until her children were all school-aged, and then she intended to work outside the home once again. And that plan was all great until she had a precious son with special needs that required round-the-clock care and attention. This was her oldest. And so she realized through the course of raising her family that God was calling her to raise this child who is now over 30. And so her calling is to just care for this child that she loves so much. She doesn't have a lot of time, and throughout the decades, she's been burdened with this calling to make a difference in the world outside of the home. But she but-Godded every step of the way. But God, you see the constant care and attention my son requires. But God, I can't do that. I don't have the time. But God, I don't know if I'll ever be able to do what you're calling me to do. But God, but God. And God kept poking at her. You felt that too? When you but God enough, he never lets you go. He's going to keep poking at you. Now go, right? And so she really discerned that one of her areas of strength was encouragement. That when she encouraged people, she noticed that they would perk up. She received feedback from folks that would say, that note that you wrote, those words that you spoke, pierced my heart and made me realize that I could go on even more. And so finally she answered God's calling. She said, you know what, I don't feel like I have all the time in the world, but I can write one note a day to somebody in the church, to somebody in my family, to a neighbor, just to encourage them along the way. God has blessed others so much. Something that she saw as a weakness, the lack of time and attention that she could give to others, God showed his glory through. Imagine getting a note from somebody that you have tremendous respect for, knowing the restraints on her time, and you get that knowing somebody that needs encouragement more than you might feel that you do. To get a note from her makes you feel like you can do anything God has called you to do. And God has used her in incredible ways. So what is God wanting to use you to do? What are the weaknesses in your life that are holding you back from accomplishing God's call? Name those right now in the silence of your heart. What are your excuses? Now turn it this way. What are the gifts that God has given you? What are the strengths that are unique to you? What can you offer the world that brings about transformation and change? What would it take for you to lead out of that, to focus on developing that part of yourself and leave the weaknesses to God? Friends, God is calling all of us to live our calling. And the one thing we do above and beyond is to just trust that God is going to show his power through our weaknesses. And God is going to use the gifts that he's given us to accomplish his will. So now, no more excuses. Go and live your calling. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.